Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Perry, and I'm the Associate Director for Professional Development and Networking. Thank you so much for logging in to watch this resume webinar today. I'm going to chat about a few things with everyone. So first, I'm going to talk about formatting your resume. Then I'm going to talk about how to strategically choose different section headings for your resume. And then I'm going to discuss how to write strong resume descriptions for your experiences on your resume. Finally, I'm going to talk about the importance of tailoring your resume to the job you're applying for. This will come up a lot throughout the presentation. It's really just important that when you are hitting submit on an application, the resume that you're including in your application is tailored to that position that you're applying for. And what I mean by that is that you were really thoughtful about which stories you were sharing on that resume so that they match up with the job qualifications of the position. And I'm going to be talking about more resume-centered ideas. So the first thing I want to talk about is style. Everyone asks me, how long should my resume be? Is it okay if I go on to 2 pages? My answer is overall yes. One thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about your resume length is employers receive hundreds of applications for the jobs that they have posted. So they really only have between 3 and 10 seconds to look through a resume during that first review session. Therefore, you want the most relevant information to be very obvious on your resume. If you have stories that are hiding on a second page, sometimes they could be missed. Overall, you want to fit the most important information on that first page. If you have a one-page resume and then maybe 2 or 3 lines are going on to a second page, that's where I'll say, hey, how about we rethink your format and your style so that we can get this back down to 1. It really depends on how much experience you have and what stories you're telling. But if you want to go onto a page and a half or 2, that's okay. Second is font size. You want your resume to be readable, so you really want to keep your font size between 10.5, 12, maybe even 10 depending on the font type that you choose. When you're thinking about margins, they should be about 1 inch around. That's the standard. But again, you can manipulate this a little bit if you want to change how much you're fitting on that first page. Here are some of my font favorites. Overall, when I'm thinking about resumes and I'm thinking about fonts, I recommend that you think about straight lines. Similarly, you want to be consistent with all of the style choices that you make. So make sure that you use all the same types of bullet points, that you use all the same font, that you're bolding and italicizing the same things, that your dates are in the same place. Sometimes if you have a second pair of eyes, look over your resume, asking someone to just look for these little inconsistencies is really helpful. Overall, you really want your resume to be crisp, clean, sleek. If you hold your resume out at arm's length, you really want it to look pleasing to the eye. And again, when you're thinking about fonts and how you're lining everything up, straight lines are just so important on a resume. Finally, I always recommend that you print your resume to make sure that nothing is getting cut off, that the color is coming out how you want, that it's a really true dark black, or if you are using color, it's the color that you want. That's always just like the one final thing that you should do, especially because some employers will print resumes, and if there's anything going wrong there, you want to get ahead of it before the employer sees. Next, I'm going to talk about formatting. So in the next slides, I'm going to showcase examples of conservative versus design resumes, 1 or 2 column resumes, indentation and spacing choices. But really what we're talking about when we talk about this style and choosing your format is the proper use of white space. White space is the area of your resume that has no text. So it's all of the space on your resume that's blank. Your white space is supposed to support and augment your content. So you just want to be strategic with how you balance that area of your resume. Similarly, you want to give the most space of your resume to the most relevant information based on the job you're applying for. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Finally, I have a thought about templates, and my thought is that you should not use them. And there are 2 reasons. Number 1, I want everyone to feel confident going back and updating their resume, making changes here or there, revisiting the document if you are starting a job search. If you use a template, a lot of times the auto formatting that comes along with the use of that type will hinder and create obstacles for those small little edits. The auto formatting just becomes a headache. So as a result, you avoid making little updates or changes that might actually really help you. The second reason I don't really like templates is because there's a lot of design gimmicks out there. So I actually have an example here. In the skills section, the way they're describing how much they know a certain skill is by filling in these dots. What do these dots mean? You really don't want to be subjective when you're talking about how well you know a skill. And this sort of gimmick is really popular when you look at designed resumes, but it's not telling the employer anything. So overall, I try and say, don't use a template, create your own document from the very beginning, create your own formatting choices, be in charge of how things look so that whenever you want to go back and make changes, it's much easier on you. So when we're thinking about conservative versus designed resumes, the resume on the left is more conservative. And what that means is they use black and white. It's sort of vertically integrated, so we know we're starting from the top and we're reading down to the bottom. Overall, the look of this resume on the left is something that has been around for a while. It's something that is familiar to employers, to familiar with job seekers. This is just something that is very standard. Then you have a design resume. This is on the right side of the screen. So this version obviously integrated color. They have icons. They're using other little designed aspects that they added to their document. When you're thinking about whether or not you want to be more conservative or designed, think about two things. Number one, the industry, and number two, the job type. So for example, the finance industry is usually more conservative. But the startup industry might be a little bit more open-minded to designs. Similarly, if you have to use design skills in the job that you're applying for, you might want to consider making more of a design resume. So for example, if you were applying to a UX designer job, you might want to include those skills throughout your resume. But for most software jobs, being more conservative and having more of a conservative resume makes the most sense. This is something that we can talk about one-on-one to really think about what will work the best for you. Next, I wanted to show some samples of two-column resumes. So the resume on the left is not my favorite, and here's why. If you look at their second column where they have their name and their contact information and their skills, that column is taking up about 1/3 of their resume. All of that information could be so much better integrated to then give their professional summary, their project experience, and their employment experience more space. Remember, I had said you want to give the most space to the stories of your resume that are most impactful. Here, this design is taking up space in a way that's not helpful. However, the resume on the right really has a good use of space. First of all, their second column is much smaller. Instead, this is taking up about 1/4 of the resume instead of 1/3. Similarly, they had thought, okay, what's really important to employers? All right, my technical skills. This is something new that I've learned. Obviously, it's really relevant for the jobs I'm applying for, so I want to put that at the top of my resume. But then the content in that second column that they included, honors, conference presentations, activities, all of those things are still important, and they're telling a little bit more about you as a candidate. They're a little bit more unique stories to tell. So it's important to include on a resume, but their work experience and projects really are getting the prime area of the resume. And that's what you always want to make sure you're doing, no matter what style you choose. Finally, I just wanted to take a note on indentation. So in both of these resumes, if the person needed to have more space in order to get more information onto their resume, I would recommend they rethink their style and their format. So the resume on the right, very standard, pretty conservative. I've seen this resume type a bunch of times. It's very familiar to anyone who works in a job where they're reviewing resumes or they're considering candidates. But let's say they wanted to add additional information onto their resume and they didn't want to go onto a second page. Something they could do easily is take all the white space that's being used under their section headings and instead make the bullet points move across the entire page. The resume on the right is really interesting because you have these first 3 sections of sort of the summary, their education. Here you can see that they decided to do single columns. Then you move into the skills section and it's 2 columns. And then you move into the experience section and it's 3 columns. I thought that was really unique and I think it works. But the one thing that I would caution against using this, again, there's all this white space that's not so much being used that might be beneficial to have if you need it. And then similarly with experiences, sometimes using some sort of bullet point will just increase readability and increase the ease of scanning on the employer side. So that's just something to consider. And I wanted to show these 2 things as examples of things I see a lot and recommendations I give a lot. So when you're thinking about your format choice, so how are you going to order your resume? There are 2 schools of thought that sort of dominate this conversation. Number 1 is the reverse chronological. So this is where you list your experience in order of dates and your most recent role goes first. And then there's functional. So instead of thinking about job types and their actual job experiences, instead you're clustering your sections by a skill set. So for example, you'll say, your heading will say leadership. And underneath all of that, you'll include any instance where you have showcased leadership, no matter what job you are in. Functional resumes used to be popular for people who have had many years of experience. I'm talking decades of work experience. However, they're losing popularity with recruiters. So I most likely will never recommend that you use a functional resume unless you've told me a unique story and we're working through something a little bit different for you. But my favorite version is strategic reverse chronological using custom headings. This is something I've sort of made up. And I have an example of this. So one way that you can think about an experience section is by combining all of your experiences. So your work experience as well as any projects that you've worked on, just like in this one huge heading. But what if we were to split these 2 headings up into a project section and an experience section? So in your project section, you can talk about any course projects that you did with MCIT Online or any passion projects that you've done as a result of the new skills you gained from this degree program. So maybe you were working on something independently with a team, maybe you were in a competition, but whenever you can showcase that practical application of your new technical skills, you want to do that. And then there's sort of a third option. So sometimes students will say, in my job, I started working on a project that I think is really relevant to showcase my technical skills, but it was just part of this main job and I did so much else. How do I tell that story? Here's my recommendation. Create a project section where, again, similar to the last section, you're talking about any personal projects that you've done. So whether that be through MCIT Online, independently, teams, competitions, that would go in your project section. Then you create this custom heading of relevant experience. So for example, say that you are helping integrate a new software into your workflow at your current job. So you were looking at how your processes work, you were getting to know this new software, and you were helping the consultants integrate that in for your team. That's something that's really interesting and you want to share and highlight. So by putting it in its own custom heading, you can make those types of things stand out. Then you have an other experience heading, and then this is where you showcase all of your transferable skills. So everything that you've been doing in your work life is still so relevant. Share those experiences because this is what makes you a unique candidate. Here are just sections you should definitely make sure you include on your resume. The starred ones are the things that need to be on every single person's resume in this program: education, skills, projects, your work experience. Now, everything else is really up to you and your preferences and what stories that you have to tell. It's something that, again, I'm happy to work with you to hear a little bit about what your past is so that we can be strategic with choosing what information to include. I have a note here about technical skills because for some of you, this might be a completely new section. You should start by thinking of every technical skill that you have. Make a giant list, do some reflection, take 20 minutes and write everything down. But something that you might want to consider to elevate this section is using subheadings. So if you can start to categorize the technical skills that you know into these different subheadings, that just showcases a deeper knowledge of technology. I get the question all the time about, should I put this on my resume? So for example, a student might say, I just started dabbling in Python, but if I got an interview question where I had to use Python, I don't feel confident doing that. Should I include that on my resume? There are two schools of thought here. The first way you can consider this question is saying the only skills you include on your resume are the things that you are confident that you can use in an advanced or intermediate manner. So if it's on your resume, you assume that you know it. But another school of thought is that you can add everything that you know, but then use this qualifying language for things that you might not know so well. So in the case of that student who was just learning Python, they would write Python on their resume, but then parentheses next to it say beginner or intermediate. Then maybe by the time you're actually interviewing, you have had more time to gain that technical skill and strengthen it. And you can talk a little bit about that process for yourself. But no matter what, if you're uncertain about whether or not you should add a skill, you can always remember that you can use sort of this qualifying language to talk about how well you know it. But the words and language I recommend are beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about writing strong resume descriptions. Overall, whenever you write a resume description for an experience you've had, there's a little bit of a formula that you can follow. You really want to be direct and concise in the language that you choose. You want to make sure that your language is actionable, and one way to accomplish that is by starting every bullet point with a strong action verb. Whenever you can, you want to quantify your experiences, and you want to be as specific as possible. So here's an example. Create a back-end transit server API that displays real-time departure times for New York City and Philadelphia public transit systems. That first part of this phrase is direct and concise, and it's very specific. They also make it actionable. They use the created, which is a pretty good action verb. But then they go on to quantify it. So over 10,000 downloads in the first 6 months. This is a really strong resume description because it sort of encompasses all 4 of these categories and of these important things that you want to include whenever you're constructing an experience description. You always want to tailor your resume. So when I say this is sort of what I mean. Number 1, identify your transferable skills and make sure that you're choosing the transferable skills that match up with the job qualifications in the specific role you're applying to. So if they're saying you need great leadership, make sure that you're describing your leadership skills in your experiences on your resume. Next, you want to know the jargon of the industry you're applying for. So what I recommend you do is you do a close reading of the job description, and whenever possible, include words that are in the job description in your resume language. You can also always get feedback from someone who's working at the company. If you know anyone who works at that company, I highly recommend reaching out and asking for their feedback on your resume. And then LinkedIn is actually a really great tool for this type of thing. So if you go on LinkedIn, you can search for companies and find profiles of people who work for those companies. Look through how those folks are describing their jobs. Look at what skills they have included in their LinkedIn profile, and just make sure you're mirroring that language as well. Penn subscribes to this service called JobScan, and what this is you can upload your resume and then it will review it as if it's an ATS. An ATS is an applicant tracking system, and this is sort of a gatekeeper that some employers will use to scan resumes and make sure that for the first round, they're getting resumes that match up with the relevant job qualifications that are posted. Through Penn, we have the opportunity to provide our students with 5 free scans. You can find the link to that on the Central Career Services website, but I'll include it in the message that I send everyone once this recording goes live. Other things to consider. So number 1, don't include a photo when you're applying to jobs within the US. Do not include references on your resume. Instead, those should be on a separate sheet. One recommendation that I have is copy the style and formatting choices that you made on your resume and apply those on your reference sheet. So use the same fonts, bold the same way, use the same size, just like keep the style consistent, because I think that's a nice way to sort of create a cohesive application and make all your documents line up. Whenever you can, add links to your resume. So add your LinkedIn, add your GitHub, add any personal websites. If you're discussing a project and you have somewhere online where you can showcase a sample of that work, definitely link it, because people are looking for the application of your skills. So this is just a good way to make that really obvious. I get a lot of questions about avoiding age discrimination in the job application and through the hiring process. Your resume is the first time an employer is getting to know you as a candidate. So here are some ways that you can sort of avoid any age discrimination that might happen. Number one, you don't want to list your education graduation years on your resume. Number two, you only want to include the last 10 years of experiences. If you really did something amazing 12 years ago, we can always try and figure out a way to strategically embed that in your resume. But sticking to the past 10 years is usually the safest bet. And then whenever you can, you want to emphasize the application of your technical knowledge. So remember when I was talking about writing good resume descriptions? If you have resume descriptions that are very lofty or fluffy and they don't have anything specific in them, that's sometimes an indication that you're coming from a too high of a level. Like you might have been working for so many years that you're not actually applying those skills anymore. And that could just sometimes hurt you or hinder you. So whenever you can, you want to showcase those specifics. These are the things that I've done, and here's how I'm still applying my knowledge. Those are the things that employers are really looking for. So when I presented this session live, I had two really good questions that I want to share with everyone here. The first was, I am a career changer. How do I make that clear on my resume? And the student was actually career changing from a background in finance into software. My recommendation for that question is use a summary or an objective on your resume. That is a great place for you to sort of tell a little bit more about your experiences and about where you want to go. So you can introduce the fact that you've had years of experience working in finance, touch on the transferable skills that you gained from your finance jobs that will apply to the software industry, and then use some future forward language about the new skills that you've developed. I think it's just a really great way to introduce yourself, introduce your story. However, a lot of times summaries can go wrong. I feel like usually I see more poorly written summaries than effective ones. So again, I'm always happy to look those over and help anyone out with that. The second question that I got from students was, if I have a designed resume, how will that impact an ATS? From what I've read, ATS systems really do have trouble looking through certain designed resumes, and sometimes design resumes are getting kicked out. But you have to ask yourself, if you're doing a designed resume, you want that to be for a job that requires design. And in that case, that employer most likely is not using an ATS. They're wanting to look at your resume and check out your design and look at your aesthetic. So if you're doing a design resume and the job requires more of a conservative format, maybe you should rethink that choice. So those are the two questions that I got, and you can always reach out if you have any more. But I hope today you learned some information that will help you go and rethink your document, make any updates, maybe polish it here or there. But thanks for watching.